There are moments in a criminal investigation where everything changes in an instant, where a single decision, a single miscalculation, a single act of desperation or arrogance collapses days of careful concealment into a trail that leads straight to someone's front door. In the case of Nancy Guthrie, that moment came without warning. A phone call was placed, investigators were already listening, and within a matter of hours, federal agents were standing on a doorstep in Southern California with badges, warrants, and answers, though not the answers anyone had been hoping for. The story of that phone call, and what it revealed about the broader investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, is a story about the collision between human desperation and modern surveillance capability. It is a story about the limits of anonymity in a digital age, and it is a story about how a case that began with a missing 84-year-old woman in Tucson, Arizona, has become one of the most complex and deeply watched kidnapping investigations in recent American memory. Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, north of Tucson, sometime in the early morning hours of February 1, 2026. The circumstances of her disappearance were troubling from the beginning. She was elderly. She had a pacemaker. She relied on daily medication. Her mobility was severely limited. As Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos would later say publicly, she could not walk 50 yards by herself. The kind of person whose absence would be noticed quickly. And it was. When family members could not reach her the following morning, when she failed to appear to watch an online church service with a friend at noon, law enforcement was called. The investigation that followed grew rapidly in scope and intensity, driven in part by who her daughter is. Savannah Guthrie, the well-known co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, is a public figure whose face is recognized across the country. When her mother went missing, the case moved from local news to national attention almost overnight. Within days of Nancy's disappearance being reported, something unusual happened. Ransom notes began arriving, not at the family's home, not through private channels, but at media outlets. The CBS affiliate Cold in Tucson was among the first to receive one, on February 2 through its online tip portal. The note demanded $6 million in Bitcoin. It included a specific deadline, 5 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday, just days after the disappearance was made public. It claimed that Nancy was alive, that she was frightened, and that she was aware of the demands being made on her behalf. The note also contained something that immediately distinguished it from a typical hoax details. Specific, granular, verifiable details about Nancy Guthrie's property that had never appeared in any media report. One of those details was a floodlight, not just the existence of a light on the property, but the specific condition of one of those lights. One of the floodlights in Nancy's backyard was broken, dangling from a wire, visibly damaged. That is not the kind of detail visible from a public street. That is not the kind of detail captured in a satellite image or mentioned in a news broadcast. That is the kind of detail known only to someone who had been on that property, inside that backyard, close enough to see the damage for themselves. The second detail was an Apple Watch. Nancy Guthrie wore one, and the watch was synced to her iPhone, which in turn received data from her pacemaker. This created a network of interconnected devices, a digital ecosystem that tracked her movements, her heart rate, her location, her daily rhythms. The person who wrote the ransom note knew about this ecosystem. Investigators confirmed what the data showed. Nancy's pacemaker stopped syncing with her Apple devices at precisely 2:28 in the morning on February 1. That timestamp became a cornerstone of the entire timeline. That kind of knowledge, the floodlight, the pacemaker, the Apple Watch, the exact moment the sync went dark, does not come from reading a newspaper. It comes from someone who had either spent time with Nancy Guthrie, spent time inside her home, or had conducted careful reconnaissance of her daily life in preparation for what followed. On February 10, the FBI released surveillance images pulled from a doorbell camera on Nancy Guthrie's own property. 4 photographs showed a figure approaching her front door in the early morning hours of February 1, wearing a ski mask, black gloves, and a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker's backpack. FBI Director Kash Patel confirmed that the individual appeared to be armed. The images showed the person striking the camera with their fist, a deliberate effort to disable it before the abduction took place. 2 days later, the FBI released a physical description. a male, approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall, with an average build. That footage represented the most significant physical evidence released to the public. And yet, as TMZ would later report, even that evidence had not produced major actionable leads. The fear quietly circulating among investigators and media observers was one no one wanted to name directly, that the case was drifting toward becoming a cold case. The volume of false tips, fraudulent ransom demands, and opportunistic intrusions into the investigation became a serious problem almost immediately. The FBI reported receiving tens of thousands of tips in the weeks. Following Nancy's disappearance by the 1-month mark, that number had climbed past 40,000. Each one had to be logged, reviewed, and, in many cases, actively investigated. Among the ones requiring the most urgent response were fake ransom communications. People who, for reasons ranging from financial opportunism to a disturbing desire for attention, decided to insert themselves into a family's worst nightmare. Derek Colella was one of those people. Colella, a 42-year-old man from Hawthorne, California, was not connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance in any way. He had not taken her. He had no information about where she was. He was, according to what he told federal investigators after being read his Miranda rights, someone who had been following the case on television and had decided to contact the family to see if they would respond. He admitted he had pulled the family's contact information from a website online. That decision, casual, perhaps even impulsive in his own telling, would cost him enormously. The sequence of events unfolded with remarkable speed. Savannah Guthrie and her siblings had released a public video appeal, with Savannah seated between her sister Annie and her brother Cameron, begging for their mother's safe return and telling whoever held her that the family was ready to pay. Within hours of that video going public, Colella sent text messages to Nancy Guthrie's daughter, Annie, and her son-in-law, Tommaso Scioni. The message read, "Did you get the Bitcoin? We're waiting on our end for the transaction." Within 3 minutes of sending those texts, he placed a phone call. The call lasted 9 seconds. 9 seconds is not long enough to say much of anything. It is barely enough time to confirm that a connection has been made. But 9 seconds was long enough for investigators who were monitoring incoming communications to the family to begin tracing its origin. Colella had placed the call using a voice-over Internet Protocol service, commonly known as VoIP. VoIP technology allows users to make phone calls through an internet connection rather than through a traditional telephone line. It is widely available, inexpensive, and frequently misunderstood as providing anonymity. Many people assume that routing a call through the internet makes it impossible to trace. That assumption is dangerously incorrect, particularly when law enforcement is involved. Using what court documents described as open-source methods, investigators determined the phone number was associated with a VoIP application that allows users to obtain a secondary number separate from the one assigned by their wireless carrier. They then obtained an emergency disclosure on the account. That disclosure revealed a single critical piece of information. The VoIP account was registered to a personal Gmail address traceable directly to Colella's residence in Southern California. By the following morning, federal agents were already in motion. Colella made his initial court appearance on February 6 at the U.S. District Court in Santa Ana, California. He was charged with transmitting a demand for ransom through interstate communications and with using a telecommunications device to anonymously harass. Federal charges. Serious charges. U.S. Attorney Timothy Corchin issued a statement that made the government's posture unmistakably clear. This case, he said, had come together in under 24 hours, from the moment the texts were sent to the moment Colella was arrested. Grief profiteers, he added, will be held accountable. When investigators spoke with Colella, he offered an explanation that was simultaneously mundane and deeply revealing. He said he had wanted to see if the family would respond. That was it. No elaborate scheme. Just curiosity dressed up in the language of someone who had watched a tragedy unfold on television and decided to reach into it with his own hands. The arrest sent a clear message. The FBI is not only searching for the person responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. it is also running a parallel operation designed to identify, investigate, and prosecute anyone who attempts to exploit the family's pain. Every fake ransom demand is pursued. Every fraudulent caller is traced. Every imposter is found. The technology exists to do this, and law enforcement has the will and the legal authority to use it. But the Colella arrest raised an uncomfortable question investigators could not escape. If his call was a hoax and his texts were fabrications, then who sent the notes that contained the details about the floodlight and the pacemaker? Who knew things that only someone connected to the crime could know? Colella was caught, but the real communicator, the one whose knowledge suggested genuine involvement, remained unidentified. The ransom notes continued to arrive. TMZ reported receiving a second significant demand later in February, described as more sophisticated than earlier communications. It demanded a different cryptocurrency than the Bitcoin specified previously, included graphic descriptions of consequences for non-payment, and arrived from a different email address entirely. For investigators analyzing communication patterns, these changes were significant, whether they indicated an evolving strategy by the original kidnapper or a copycat exploiting details from the earlier genuine note. The FBI would not say publicly. What investigators did confirm was that they were consulting artificial intelligence experts to analyze the notes linguistically, a recognition that modern AI writing tools can now scrub the very patterns forensic analysts have historically depended on. Every writer has a signature habits of vocabulary, sentence structure, grammatical tendencies so deeply ingrained, they persist even when the writer tries to disguise them. But a language model can erase those signatures entirely. It can generate a ransom note with no errors, no verbal tics, no idiosyncrasies that might betray the author's identity. This creates an investigative landscape of extraordinary difficulty. When a note arrives, investigators must now determine whether the text was written by a human at all, and if so, whether AI was used to disguise the original voice. In a kidnapping investigation involving an 84-year-old woman with serious health conditions, that extra layer of uncertainty costs something the investigation cannot afford to lose time. The proof of life problem compounds everything else. In a traditional kidnapping, the pathway to negotiation runs through verification. The family demands proof that their loved one is alive. The kidnapper provides something, a photograph, a recording that confirms the victim's continued survival. But technology has made proof of life simultaneously more urgent and more elusive. Deep fake technology can generate convincing photographs of a person in a location they have never visited. Voice synthesis tools can produce audio recordings that sound exactly like a specific individual. A photograph of Nancy Guthrie holding a current newspaper could be fabricated. A voice recording of her speaking her daughter's name could be generated from nothing at all. Savannah Guthrie acknowledged this directly in one of her public appeals, noting that the family was ready to talk, but that they lived in a world where voices and images could be easily manipulated. They wanted proof. They needed proof, but they could no longer simply accept a photograph or a recording at face value. Meanwhile, law enforcement continued to pursue physical leads. The Pima County Sheriff's Department launched an operation in mid-February at a residence approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home. 2 people were removed from the property and questioned. A gray Range Rover in the parking lot of a nearby restaurant was seized and towed. A delivery driver in Rio Rico, Arizona was briefly detained after a court-authorized search of his home, then released his attorney, confirming no link to the disappearance. Investigators also analyzed Ring camera footage from across the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, including video of a vehicle traveling approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's home around 2:30 in the morning, on February 1st, consistent with the pacemaker timeline. The FBI said it had accumulated an estimated 10,000 hours of footage in total, all of it under active review. Former FBI agent Tracy Walder offered a theory that resonated publicly. She did not believe this was a robbery that escalated. Suspects in burglaries do not typically take a victim with them. It complicates escape and multiplies risk. The act of removing Nancy Guthrie from the scene indicated intention. A targeted operation. Someone with either a personal grievance involving Savannah Guthrie or an obsession with her. Former CIA agent Tim Romer, who also served as Arizona's Director of Homeland Security, focused on something different: human error. Whoever is behind this will eventually make a mistake. One wrong technology choice, one unexpected digital trail. That is what breaks cases like this. The family's reward grew dramatically on February 24th, when Savannah Guthrie announced an additional $1 million from the family themselves, payable in cash to anonymous tipsters on top of the FBI's standing reward of $100,000. More than 1,500 new tips arrived in the days following that announcement. Of those, CNN reported that more than 750 were considered credible enough for closer review. As the case entered its fifth week with no named suspect, Savannah Guthrie publicly confronted the possibility that her mother might no longer be alive. She acknowledged that Nancy may have already gone home to the Lord she loved. And yet the family continued. The plea videos continued. The tip lines stayed open, because hope, however battered, remains the operational posture that drives every decision in a missing persons investigation. What makes the Colella case instructive is not the arrest itself. What makes it instructive is the speed. 9 seconds. The call had barely connected before investigators had already begun the trace. The case came together in under 24 hours. Every communication carries risk. Every call leaves a record. Every text generates metadata. The anonymity that digital communication seems to promise is conditional. Conditional on law enforcement not having a reason to look, not having legal authority to compel disclosure, not having the resources to pursue the trail. In this investigation, all three conditions have been met in the opposite direction. The trace that led to Derek Colella was a dead end in terms of finding Nancy. But the infrastructure that produced that trace, the monitoring capability, the legal authority, the forensic expertise, the coordination between agencies remains in place and fully operational. The next communication, whatever form it takes, will enter the same system. It will be received, flagged, analyzed, and if traceable, that source will be identified. Investigators will be at the door before the caller has time to wonder whether they made a mistake. Somewhere, Nancy Guthrie is either alive or she is not. Investigators are working as though she is, because that is both the hope they carry and the posture that gives their work its urgency. Every ransom note is analyzed. Every tip is reviewed. Every frame of surveillance footage is examined. This is the machinery of a federal investigation at full capacity, pointed at a single objective. If you have information about Nancy Guthrie's whereabouts, investigators need your help. The FBI reward stands at $100,000. The Guthrie family's reward of $1 million remains unclaimed, payable in cash to anonymous tipsters. The tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The investigation is ongoing, and somewhere in the middle of all of this, the notes and the traces, the hoaxes and the forensic analysis, the 40,000 tips and the ring camera footage playing on loop in a federal review room in Tucson. A family is standing outside their mother's house, laying yellow flowers at the fence and waiting for someone to bring her home.